Good afternoon and good morning and welcome to PatristiCast. This is episode 13 of the Scholars Forum. I'm your host, John Solheid, here in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Today, very pleased to welcome my guest, Dr. Mark Edwards, who is Professor of Early Christian Studies, Patristics at Oxford University, and tutor in theology. Dr. Edwards is the author of many monographs, notably Origen against Plato, Culture and Philosophy in the Age of Plotinus, Religions in the Constantinian Empire, and most recently, Aristotle and Early Christian Thought, which is going to be the subject of the conversation today. So Dr. Edwards, welcome to PatristiCast.
Good afternoon.
Before we get into the book, I just wanted to familiarize myself and the audience with you a little bit. You tackle one of the major, for some odd reason, it's stuck around. It's like a nuisance that these distinctions that people draw between like Christianizing Plato or Platonizing Christians. This kind of seems to be an overarching subject for you, and you take issue with it. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that came about?
Yes, well, I think it's been quite common to write the history of early Christian thought as if early Christians were sort of trying to imitate the Greek philosophers, but failing, just not doing it very well. Sometimes this is because classicists write the history and they naturally assume the superiority of the ancient classical writers. But you also find this in Christianity, as in theology as well, that even people who actually have in some ways quite a high respect for the early Christian tradition tend to think of Christian philosophy as something that's at best parasitic on ancient philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, Stoics, etc. And of course, I don't want to deny that they grew up in a world where these philosophies were known to educated people. And of course, many early Christians have a very high respect for some ancient philosophers. Most of them have a high respect for Plato. And as I hope to show in my book on Aristotle, they had an increasingly high respect for Aristotle. So I'm not denying that. I'm not denying there was lots of intellectual commerce. But at the same time, I think there is a certain basis to Christian thinking which is very distinctive, in the same way as there's a basis to Stoic thinking or Aristotelian thinking or Platonic thinking, which is distinctive to those schools. So we have to recognize that Christian thought is developing organically from its own beginnings. It has certain fundamental premises, of which one is, for example, the omnipotence of a personal God who brings the world into existence by his own will and isn't constrained by any external necessities or indeed possibilities. And of course, another is the inerrancy of biblical revelation. So they have certain premises of their own, which they're always faithful to, and any interaction with Greek philosophy that they undertake here has to be seen as part of this developing tradition, or it's organically related to the primitive revelation on which they're basing their thought. So I think labeling Christians simply as Platonists or Aristotelians is sort of missing the point. It's as if one were to call Aristotle himself a Platonist. I mean, obviously, Aristotle learns a great deal from Plato. He, in many ways, constructs his thought, in dialogue with Plato. But unless we're trying to, be provocative, we don't say that Aristotle's a Platonist. We don't say that Stoics are Platonists. And so, it's not, as I say, that I don't want to admit any commerce between Christianity and philosophy, but I want to see Christianity as an autonomous philosophy with its own fundamental principles, its own first principles, as the ancients said, and not simply borrowing in a magpie-like fashion from all the schools it had encountered.
Yeah, okay. And your book does that quite nicely, because you're not replacing Plato with Aristotle. So you're not saying the early Christians are just a bunch of Aristotelians. In fact, you go to great lengths to show how they grappled with Aristotle, but really their starting point was always biblical revelation.
Mhm.
They would perhaps apply Aristotelian principles, but it was never to understand Aristotle himself or to construct an Aristotelian worldview, but to help to explain some problems that emerge in the biblical text.
Yes, certainly up to until the 6th century at least. So I think, in a certain sense, early Christian writers aren't exactly philosophers. They don't usually take what we think of as philosophical questions as their main objects. So if they're engaging in a logical exercise, if they're for example, trying to make sense of Aristotle's categories, where Aristotle explains what he understands by the term being, it won't be primarily because they're interested in logic, but because they're trying to explain how Jesus Christ can be simultaneously God and man, or how the three persons of the Trinity can also be one God. So yeah, there'll be a theological question to which the logical investigation is subsidiary. And likewise, they're not interested in metaphysics for its own sake, but only in explaining the nature of God. I mean, in that respect, they're rather different from some medieval thinkers, many of whom we could say are also philosophers in their own right. But in early Christian thinking, philosophy is always ancillary to their theological questions. And obviously, in a sense, their theological questions are not questions, because the answer is already determined by the Bible as they read it. So it's not an open question for most early Christians whether God is a Trinity or whether Jesus Christ was God and man. The question is simply how you explain that. And philosophy is the tool, or one of the tools, by which they try to arrive at that explanation.
Yeah. As you just explained that, the first case that comes to my mind is the preface to Origen's On First Principles, where he lays out something that we would probably call like a rule of faith. So points of doctrine that are already fixed, such as souls have free will and we're punished or rewarded according to our actions. But Origen goes on to say then, well, that is a fixed dogma. The nature of the soul is not, and it's open for exploration, for which he probably by necessity almost has to use some philosophical concepts to explain that problem. You bring up the categories, Aristotle's categories, and one of the questions that emerges in your book, that in late antiquity there is even perhaps some debate about what was the subject of the categories. Was it language? Was it ontology? And you seem, if I'm getting you right, you seem to come down on the side that they understood it to be kind of both. It's words and language insofar as it actually signifies that which it's supposed to signify.
I think most of them are moving in that direction. Once they start to look at the categories seriously, it's usually after the end of the 3rd century, and many of them will be strongly influenced by the writing of Porphyry, the Neoplatonist, who was notorious as an enemy of Christianity, but that didn't stop Christians from making use of his introduction to Aristotle's logic, which is normally called the Isagoge, as well as his commentary on the categories. And it's Porphyry who says, there's a debate as to whether this is just about words or about things. And in his view, it's about words insofar as they signify the semantic use of words, which in a way is no solution at all. And of course, people have continued to argue over what Porphyry meant, just as they continue to argue over what Aristotle meant. But as you say, it's I think it's often a bit uncertain, perhaps even in the minds of early Christians themselves, exactly when they're talking about language and when they're talking about things. And of course, when you're talking about God, there's a particular problem, because at least, in the normal world, we can point to things. We can make a distinction very easily between the word book and the book that I'm pointing to. When we're talking about God, what have we got but words? And so in a way, I think it does tend to come back to words, because as the church fathers recognize, we really got nothing else.
two things come to mind there. One is so you've been a reader of Origen for some time. I don't know if you've encountered his homilies on the Psalms yet at all, the Greek collection that was found not too long ago.
I've read parts of them. I mean, I haven't been working on Origen so much since those were discovered, but yes, I'm somewhat familiar with them. Yeah.
There's a conversation that he has. Actually, there's a number of conversations where he has in these homilies, and he brings up the principle of homonymy, which you bring up in your book a number of times from Aristotle's Categories, which is one of the things. I think it's like right at the very beginning of Categories where he draws a distinction between a homonym and a synonym.
Right. Yeah.
And Origen applies that to biblical language when the Bible speaks of things like the physical organs, like the heart in Matthew 5:8, blessed are the pure in heart. He directly applies the principle of homonymy and says that when the Bible is using this term, we're not talking about the vital organ that we all have. We're talking about the intellect, which is the source of our actions, the source of our good and evil. The other thing that comes to mind is in your chapter on Gregory of Nyssa and their conversations on God. How can we speak of God? And sometimes Gregory emerges as someone who's quite brilliant, but also at the same time a bit inconsistent. You say somewhere, I don't know if I can find it, but it seems like he wants to say on the one hand that we can predicate things of God, but on the other hand, we can't. Can you talk a little bit about Gregory? That's a very interesting conversation within the context of the Trinitarian debates.
Yeah. Well, just to talk about homonymy for a minute. I mean,
Okay.
there is quite a long discussion on homonymy in Origen's preface to his commentary on the Song of Songs as well. And
That's right.
as you say, the homonymy which is important to him is between what he calls the inner and the outer man.
That's right.
So they're both men, as it were, or humans. But one's the visible human that we know, and the other is the invisible human, which in some ways what we really are, but rather sometimes perhaps rather elusive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to recognize, we talk about Origen as an allegorist. And Origen does use the term allegory, but no more often than he uses other terms like tropology or homonymy or whatever.
That's right.
And I don't know that he necessarily defines these very carefully, but I would say that in the classical world, allegory tends to mean substituting not another sense of X for an original sense of X, but Y for X. So allegory is like representing a city as a ship, or representing a girl as a horse. And Origen does think that the Bible does that. But when he's talking about homonymy, it's something slightly different, because if I'm substituting the inner man for the outer man, then they're still, as I say, they're both human beings, so they're both actually called by the same word. It's just that one is inner and one is outer. So it's a little different from allegory, where it's a completely different term. Yeah. And of course, Gregory of Nyssa is indebted to Origen for his use of allegory as well. And although his homilies, his commentary on the Song of Songs, is a very different work from either Origen's commentary or homily on the Song of Songs, that he does acknowledge a debt to Origen, and you can often see him taking up Origen's ideas. But Gregory is writing, of course, after the Council of Nicaea, whereas Origen was writing before. And the Council of Nicaea, although it hadn't exactly defined what we now call the Trinity, had asserted that the Son is God, true God, and effectively that he is co-eternal with the Father, both of which Origen believed. But the Council of Nicaea, I suppose, makes this an ecclesiastical norm, and not simply a matter of personal speculation. And Gregory was opposed by a number of people, but above all, his opponent is a man called Eunomius, who was a very, very free-thinking sort of person, and one of the few ancient heretics, as it were, who actually admits to being in a minority and doesn't claim he's speaking for the whole church. But Eunomius's position was that if you understand logic, you will realize that the Father and the Son cannot have the same essence, because the Father has the property of being ingenerate, having no parent, as it were, and the Son has the property of being generated, because obviously he is the Son. So one of them is generated, one of them is ungenerated. And according to Eunomius, given that the Father and the Son are both incorporeal, the only thing that defines them is their attributes. So if the Father is defined by the attribute of being ungenerated and the Son is defined by the attribute of being generated, how can they have the same essence? And it's in response to this, which is not a negligible argument in ancient terms. Gregory responds by saying, well, first of all, it's a mistake to think that we can define the essence of God. The words that we use, including the word God itself, only refer to the operations of the divine in the present world. They can't tell us about the nature of the divine, because that's completely unfathomable to us. There's no way that we can know what God is in himself. We've got no language for that. And so Gregory uses what we call this apophaticism, this denial of being able to speak about God, as a way of rebuking Eunomius for his presumption. On the other hand, of course, Gregory is not defending a kind of agnosticism. He's defending the Nicene doctrine of the Trinity, which does make some fairly positive assertions, such as the fact that the Son and the Father are both God. They both have the same essence. In fact, the word homoousios, consubstantial or coessential, was introduced into Christian parlance by the Council of Nicaea. So, I mean, I think Gregory is doing something sort of almost surreptitiously that a man whom we call Dionysius the Areopagite, or who called himself Dionysius the Areopagite 2 centuries later, did more openly. Dionysius says, well, on the one hand, from a philosophical point of view, as it were, there's absolutely nothing we can say about God, and what defines God is the fact that we can't say anything about him. On the other hand, theologically, as it were, God has revealed himself through the scriptures. So alongside the apophatic ignorance of God, which philosophy teaches us, we have this, what Dionysius calls cataphatic knowledge of God, this assertive or positive knowledge of God, which is what the scripture teaches us. And in a sense, it's not knowledge because it's all symbolic, but nonetheless, it gives us, as it were, the grammar and the vocabulary which we use to talk about God. So because God reveals that there is a Father and a Son, and that they are both God, that the Bible tells us this, then we have to believe that there is a Father and a Son, and that they're both God. Whether we can understand it or not is another matter. We have to recognize that it's mystery and we can't understand it. But what we can't do is use philosophy to negate it in the way that Eunomius would claim. Philosophy can just, as it were, put limits on our understanding of theology. Philosophy can warn us that nothing that is communicated to us theologically is transparently true. But on the other hand, it can't tell us that what's communicated to us theologically is false, because we know that revelation has to be true.
Yeah, you bring this out. Much of this debate was necessitated by the introduction of terms that aren't really biblical. They're philosophical. Homoousion, for one. So for the non-academic who might be watching this, it's consubstantial, which is what we say in the Creed. Ousia. And these are all terms that are hotly debated even in the philosophical schools. What do they mean? So then how we apply these terms in a theological context to God becomes a matter of central importance. And that's what's playing out in the 4th century. I think you bring that out.
That's right, yes. And it's not always by the use of those terms. I mean, Gregory of Nyssa and his 2 Cappadocian associates, his brother Basil and his friend Gregory Nazianzen, do have a lot to say about the word homoousios. On the other hand, Athanasius, the great defender of the Council of Nicaea, sometimes works without the word homoousios and sometimes insists on it, depending on what circumstances he's writing in. I think what Athanasius recognizes that there are dangers in using an unbiblical term, because people who would otherwise be well disposed to you might simply shrink from asserting something that they feared to be unbiblical. But I think what Athanasius wants to say is that at the very least, the Trinity isn't, as it were, just something that God decided to be. Whereas for Eunomius, the very existence of the second person, let alone the third person, It's just a matter of the Father willing them into existence. And if he'd not felt like it, then he wouldn't have done so. Athanasius wants to say that because God is love, God is, as it were, social. Even before there's a world, even in the absence of any creation, there's a Father, Son, and a Holy Spirit united by mutual love. And Gregory Nazianzen wants to say the same thing, and indeed Augustine. Yeah. And I think, in real terms, as it were, that's what the word homoousios comes down to, that God is Trinity by nature and not Trinity by some arbitrary act of will that might well have been otherwise. Okay.
Now, there's a point when you talk about the word dynamis, power or potentiality in Gregory. And you say something here that struck me as kind of Origenian in a way. And I'll just quote, and I think you're actually quoting Gregory here. And this is in response to Eunomius. Let's see, where should I start this? His capital error, they urged, and I think that his was be the Eunomius here, was to mistake the truth that is thus vouchsafed to our limited understanding for the unobtainable knowledge of God's own nature. Basil the Great and his brother Gregory never tire of repeating that aienitos is a privative, not a positive term, means it negates something, revealing not the essence of God, but rather our inability to define that essence except by denying its likeness to all that lies within our own domain of knowledge. And then you go on to quote Gregory. The Lord in himself is whatever he is by nature, but when he is named by the differentiation of his energies, he does not have one designation, but receives a name according to each concept which accrues to us from the energy, end quote. So according to each concept, the word concept is the Greek that Gregory is working with there, is that epinoia?
If it's concept, it would I'd have thought it was enoia, but I'm not.
Enoia, okay.
Well,
the reason I ask is it seems like he's making a similar argument to Origen's second book in the John commentary, where he goes on that lengthy diatribe about epinoia. Is that similar to what's going on here?
I think he is taking it from Origen. I mean, Origen uses the word epinoia for the biblical titles that are given to God, like shepherd and word and wisdom. And in Origen's view, some of these are, I suppose, more proper than others. So calling the second person the wisdom of God comes closer to defining what he is than anything else. Then calling him the Logos defines his relation to us. And calling him shepherd or king, again, defines certain particular relationships that he has to us. The point that Basil and Gregory want to make, I think, is epinoia to them is contrasted with enoia. So Eunomius thinks we can have an enoia, a concept of God. Basil and Gregory think you can only have that a concept would imply some kind of correlation, if you like, between the concept and the thing. And so we can't really have a concept of God because God is too inscrutable. So what we have is an epinoia, which, as it were, is one step removed from a concept. It's something which isn't equivalent, to the thing in the way that my concept of a cat might be in some way equivalent to the cat.
It reflects more how we reflect on God, not the concept itself.
Yeah. So there's, as it were, there isn't the same truth value in an epinoia as there is in an enoia, but we can't have true and adequate understandings of God.
Now, this might strike modern readers as hair splitting, but in this period, it's actually vitally important. And I think it's something that emerges in your book, is that, Christians, we Christians, I think we can say we here, believe in a triune God. And in the Bible, as Origen says, there's all these names that are given. So then a question from a philosopher might be, so is God one or is God many? And of course, the Christians have to maintain that God is one and three. And as you say, when Origen addresses the titles, it's not that God is very many things. He's not a shepherd and wisdom. He is all those things but one. And so that's sort of how they're engaging these philosophical debates that are probably presented to them by pretty astute opponents who say, well, wait a second, you say you're a monotheist, but really you're talking about all these different gods. And this emerges kind of it. I never thought about this before, but it seems to be rooted somewhat in Aristotelian uh, uh, concepts here of how do we predicate things of God while maintaining also God's singularity, his oneness.
Mhm. Yes, I mean, of course, it's not a huge problem for Aristotle himself because he doesn't talk about God that often, but there's a famous discussion of God at the end of the book that we know as Metaphysics Lambda.
Yeah.
And there God is pure thought, basically, thought thinking itself, one could say, which for Aristotle is also the same thing as pure actuality. That's to say, something in which there's no potential to be anything else, what Aquinas later called actus purus. So God, by his nature, is that which could never be anything other than he is. And it's one of the rare cases where Aristotle actually posits something that's incorporeal, something that has no body, no matter, and yet exists, and isn't embedded in something else. So the uniqueness of God, the singularity of God, is fairly straightforward for Aristotle. From a Christian point of view, the problem with the Aristotelian God is that he doesn't seem to think of anything but himself. And first of all, there's a kind of lack of content, because thinking of himself just means thinking of the thinking of the thinking of himself, etc. And secondly, although Aristotle says that everything in the world aspires to this kind of actuality and is drawn towards God as the lover is drawn towards the beloved, Christians, of course, don't think that God just moves the world in that way. He doesn't move the world just as a final cause, as an object of love, although he is that. God is also the efficient cause of the world, according to Christians. And he's brought the world into being. It's not eternal, whereas for Aristotle, the world is eternal. So there are all kinds of problems with this Aristotelian God, which means that Aristotle's theology can only really become meaningful to Christians when it's united with a kind of Platonism by the Neoplatonists. But certainly when it comes to talking about the Trinity, Christians do increasingly use the terminology of Aristotle's logic, even while they recognize that, what they believe in, the God who is one and also three, couldn't actually be made, something Aristotle himself could make sense of. But they're not claiming that this is an Aristotelian doctrine, but they are using Aristotelian terminology, or discussing terms like ousia, anyway, which Aristotle used. And Aristotle himself thinks that the term ousia, which means being, has a number of different uses. So one of the things that Christians themselves have to decide is, are we using the word ousia in homoousios to mean a concrete individual, or does it mean something more like a species? Could we say, for example, that God is the name of the species to which the Father, Son, and Spirit belong as concrete individuals, in the way that you and I are both concrete instantiations of the species called human? Could we say the Father, Son, and Spirit are just three instantiations of the species called man or human? And there is a letter, a notorious letter, probably by Gregory of Nyssa, but actually in Basil the Great's corpus, where the author seems to say this. But clearly it's inadequate. And Gregory of Nyssa wrote another letter, the letter known as To Ablabius, or that there are not three gods, in which he argues that you mustn't take the comparison of the three persons to three human beings to imply that God is just the name of the species, because of course the mystery of the Trinity consists in the fact that these three persons are identical, with one being called God. Not that these three persons are just members of the same class, because then there wouldn't be a mystery at all. There'd just be three gods, which is exactly what Eunomius accuses the Cappadocians of believing, but what they don't want to believe. And Augustine, again, takes up this same question, can we see the members of the Trinity as if they were three members of one class? And again, of course, Augustine says, no, you certainly can't do that, because that's not what God is. He's not a species, he's a being in his own right. So you often find them, taking up Aristotelian terminology and perhaps experimenting with a genuinely Aristotelian use of it. In Aristotelian terms, we would say, the Father, Son, and Spirit are instances of first ousia, and God is an instance of second ousia. But they realize that that won't work. The Aristotelian model won't work, even though they're trying to use Aristotelian terminology. And this is, where obviously, ultimately all Christian attempts, to harness ancient philosophy, at least in the ancient world, end up with a certain degree of distancing from the ancient philosophy because they recognize its incompatibility with what they're dogmatically required to believe.
Mm. This whole conversation makes me think of the verb to be, which is where we get ousia.
Mhm.
It seems to be probably the most abstract word in any language it's ever been uttered in. And I don't know if you remember how much you pay attention to American politics, but it was when Clinton was on trial for his little shenanigans with Monica Lewinsky, he uttered that famous expression, "It depends on what your definition of is." It
Indeed,
seems like that we've been debating what the meaning of that term is
Mhm.
for millennia, and Clinton falls right into it. You mentioned earlier causation, and this is in metaphysics. This is where Aristotle comes up with his notion of this unmoved mover
Mhm.
through deductive reasoning. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because Aristotle, for him, there were four causes. You mentioned two: the efficient and the final.
Mhm.
There was also, what were the other two? It was
Formal and
formal,
material.
formal and material.
Formal and material. Yeah.
Formal and material. So talk a little bit about how Aristotle uses that to work back to this logical conclusion that there must be this unmoved mover, that there must be something that's causing this all.
Yeah. So the distinction is, if you imagine an artist, a sculptor, let's say, making a statue, then the efficient cause of the statue will be the sculptor himself.
Mhm.
The formal cause will be the idea that he has in his mind when he starts working. The final cause will be the sculpture itself when it's completed. That's what he's aiming at. And the material cause will be the stone that he's making the sculpture out of.
Mhm.
The causes that interest Aristotle most in the metaphysics, I suppose, are final. He shares with Plato, I think, a horror of chance and fate. Any idea that the universe doesn't have a purpose, doesn't have some kind of end, is abhorrent to him as it is to Plato. Plato had argued, because first of all, that all reality is defined by transcendent forms, of which things in this world are in some sense either copies or instantiations, and that the world itself, at least mythologically, is understood by Plato as having been brought into being by a god whom he calls a demiurge.
Mhm.
And the demiurge creates the world in the image of these forms, these transcendent forms. And above all things, above the forms and above the demiurge, for Plato, is the good, the final, which we might call the final cause of everything, but perhaps we could also call it the ultimate value. And everything exists for some kind of end. Everything exists for the good. So any explanation of the universe that was purely in terms of efficient causes for Plato would be defective. It's much more important to explain what things are for than where they come from. Aristotle clearly shares this view, although he doesn't accept the Platonic theory of forms in the sense which Plato is normally thought to have held it, because he doesn't think that the essences of things can exist separately from the things themselves. He does, however, think that the essences of things are still important to define them. So, in a sense, what a thing really is its form rather than its matter. But at the same time, the form can't just exist without the matter. So each of us could be seen in a way as a compound of matter and form. We're all, as it were, aspiring to be a human being, with more or less success. But there's a large part of us which isn't identical with the essence of being human, because this body which I have now will become the body of something else. The form of the human, if you like, that which it is to be human abides forever. There always will, in Aristotle's view, be human beings. But any particular creature that we now call a human being will eventually become something else. And so it will only be a transitory instantiation of the species. Now this, what I've spoken of as aspiring is, what Aristotle sees matter basically as doing. That matter in a way aspires to the condition of form, but it can't reach it because then it wouldn't be matter anymore. What we see in God is that, well, there's been no conversion in God's case because there never was any matter. But what we see in God, as I say, uniquely in Aristotle, really is this form without matter. And so this purposiveness of the universe, which Aristotle believes in as much as Plato, is sort of summed up, if you like, in this person of God. That pure actuality is what matter is always striving for, but what it only attains in the person of God. Now, God, as I say, is self-thinking thought. The highest part of us also is intellect. Aristotle's not entirely sure even where intellect comes from. There's a famous statement in his Generation of Animals that it seems to come from outside. And there's a discussion in his book on the soul, very brief allusion to what he calls the active reason, which in some way or other makes it possible for us to see things, to know things, other things, and to know ourselves. And it's not clear whether this active reason is something over and above our everyday intelligence, or whether it's just another aspect of our intelligence, or whether it's even God. In the Middle Ages, I think there were as many as 35 different explanations as to what Aristotle means by the active reason. But there is, anyway, whatever it is exactly, this nous poietikos, active intellect or active reason, somehow or other is what makes it possible for us to think. And there were certainly ancient Aristotelian commentators who actually identified this active reason with God. So there's one strand of Aristotelian thinking, which in the Middle Ages was allegedly represented by the Arab philosopher Averroes, which identifies the pure human intellect with God himself. Now that may or may not be so. I mean, the problem is that, as I say, Aristotle very rarely talks about God, and that particular book of the Metaphysics is thought by many people to be an early work, and perhaps, when he was a bit closer to Plato than he was. So, some people would argue that it doesn't really fit into his system at all. But yet it's certainly the case that, whatever the position of God in Aristotle's mature system, he does believe that everything has a natural tendency to move towards form and actuality, and away from mere potentiality.
Yeah, this is a wonderful conversation. It's one that I grappled with. So the three key Greek terms here are dynamis, so potentiality. And I think you rightly say that for the Christians, dynamis is more power than potentiality. But then there's also energeia and enteleki. And I found myself asking, what is the difference between energeia and enteleki?
And so I think, so dynamis is potentiality or power. It can be either the power to do something or the actual exercise of power. I have the dynamis, the potentiality to read. If I pick up a book, then I actualize my dynamis, and that counts as an energeia.
Okay.
And likewise, I'm energizing the potentiality of the book to be read as well. And in the ordinary process of things, you have to start with an agent. Aristotle doesn't put it in terms of chicken and egg, but his answer to the chicken and egg question is the chicken came first. There has to be an agent to actualize the dynamis. So there has to be a reader before there can be a book, basically. Now, entelechia is, I think, one meaning of energeia. Energeia can mean either actuality or activity. So if I actualize my potentiality to be a human being, or let's say if I actualize my potentiality to be a good human being, then I achieve the energeia of a wise man, let's say, and that's what I am. And in that sense, you could say that that's my entelechia as well. That's what defines my being. But energeia can also mean activity. So as I say, reading.
Mhm, mhm.
So, and in that sense, one would be less likely, I think, to use the word energeia if it's an activity. Aristotle says at one point that every actuality has its characteristic activity. So, if I'm the actual wise man, then there are certain activities which I can be expected to perform on the basis of what I am.
Mhm.
So, entelikeia, I think, tends to be more what I am. And that can be described as energeia, but energeia can also be used to describe what I do. And of course, to go back to what we were saying about Greg of Nyssa earlier, when he talks about the energeia of God, he's always talking about what God does, because that's the only thing that's visible to us. Energeia, in the sense of what God actually is something inscrutable.
Okay, all right, great, that makes sense. Okay, so I wanted to get into a couple of debates, not me debating you, but a couple of the debates that you bring out in the book. Because as you say, there are implications of this, one of which has to deal with these debates about fate, particularly in the 2nd century. So you get Alexander of Aphrodisias, who's the chair of Aristotelian philosophy in Athens.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, debating with the Stoics on fate. Origen jumps in. You have that nice section on Origen, the Aristotelian with the question mark.
Mm-hmm.
So what's happening in the 2nd century with fate? What's going on here?
Well, I mean, one sometimes wonders really whether anything is at issue or whether it's just a matter of words. But what Alexander understands the Stoics to be saying is that everything is fated, in the sense that there's an unbreakable chain of efficient causes, which entails, not only my existence, but also everything that I'm going to do. And the Stoic, and according to Alexander, the Stoics see everything in terms of these efficient causes and not in terms of final causes. They also, according to Alexander, see God as sort of embedded in the world, not free of the world, as it were, and even being acted upon by the world as well as acting upon it. So God is almost as much a prisoner of the world as we are.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for Alexander, on the other hand, because he's an Aristotelian, of course, what he wants to emphasize above all is that we're motivated by final causes. We have reasons, as it were, for acting. I have certain ends which I form rationally. They're not automatically conditioned by some what we would now think of as a chain of atomic movements or something. They're not imposed upon me by my electrochemical constitution or my genetic constitution or anything like this. I am actually free to identify the good and pursue it.
Mm-hmm.
And he claims that on the Stoic view, I'm not free to do that. Now, we don't have a lot of, as it were, hard thinking by the Stoics on this matter. We tend to rely on Alexander for certain things, certain information about the Stoics. It's not that we don't have any Stoic writing. I mean, we've got Seneca, we've got Epictetus, we've got Marcus Aurelius, Eugenius Rufus. There's quite a plethora of Stoics, but they're all writing ethically, and they don't go very much into metaphysics, and they tend indeed to be rather contemptuous of metaphysical reasoning and say, those old books that Stoics wrote in the 3rd century BC, don't read those. Just concentrate on living a good life. So it's not, people like Marcus Aurelius and Seneca won't really. Don't really get to these hard analytical arguments about what is in our power and what is not in our power. I think what one can work out, what they're basically saying is, well, look, most of the things that go on in the world are not in your power, so you should forget about them. Obviously, there's nothing you can do about the weather. There's nothing you can do about the movements of the heavenly bodies. There's not much you can do about the way people around you are acting. Mm-hmm. All you can do is cultivate your own impassibility, live according to your own, to nature, as they would say, so live with integrity, be what a human being's meant to be. And in many ways, Alexander of Aphrodisias would say exactly the same. Yeah. They both basically believe that human beings are free to live virtuous lives. And so when it comes down to it, it may be that they're arguing more about the terminology than they are, about the practical outcomes. But one thing which makes Alexander different from Aristotle is that he's a very religious man. He talks about God and the gods all the time. And he's particularly concerned about the question of foreknowledge. Because clearly the Stoics or someone has said, well, look, if there is such a thing as foreknowledge, then there must be fate. If someone can foreknow the future must already be fixed, and there's nothing you can do to change it. Mm-hmm. Now, Aristotle, in a famous discussion, normally known as a sea battle, basically said that the future isn't fixed. We can't make true propositions about the future, according to Aristotle. So even if I said there's going to be a sea battle tomorrow, and there is a sea battle tomorrow, Aristotle would say I hadn't made a true statement. It was just as it were by accident that what happened coincided with what I said, but there was no way that I could have known for certain it was going to happen. Now, Alexander can't agree with Aristotle on this because he believes in oracles. Everybody in the 2nd century AD seems to be very concerned about oracles. And the Stoics believe in oracles as well. Mm-hmm. So for the Stoics, this is straightforward. They say, well, oracles exist, the gods predict the future, therefore the future is fixed. Mm-hmm. Whereas Alexander has to say, well, no, the gods don't quite predict the future, as it were. The gods, as it were, are reliant on stochastic reasoning. They're reliant on estimation, calling the odds, as it were, just as much as we are, except the gods are in a better position to do it. Mm-hmm. So the gods are in the gods guess as to what's going to happen to the future is going to be a lot more accurate than ours. But strictly speaking, it's still not knowledge. Now, for Origen, of course, this won't do either. He can't attribute to his god a purely stochastic knowledge. Even a 99.9% level of accuracy is not good enough for God as far as Origen's concerned. So it has to be possible, on his view, for God to have absolute infallible knowledge of the future. And yet Origen still wants to say the future is not fixed as far as we're concerned. We're still free. God may know what we're going to do, but that doesn't prevent us from making a choice. It's just that God knows what we will choose. Mm-hmm. And this, of course, leads into a conundrum that philosophers are still debating today. Is it possible to have absolute foreknowledge of the future without the future being determined? Mm-hmm. And Origen doesn't, I think, get deeply into this question. He's satisfied with making a distinction between foreknowledge and predestination, and he doesn't answer the logical difficulties that raises. Augustine later does, but in the sense of putting everything down to predestination, at least as far as our salvation is concerned. And then there's a famous discussion by Boethius, which I mentioned right at the end of my book, where he effectively says, well, because God transcends all time, God sees the future in the same way as he sees the past. And if you're not worried that the past is fixed and unalterable, then imagine God seeing the future in just the same way as you see the past. Mm-hmm. Which will be all right, except that, of course, Christians want God to intervene. They want God in some way to determine the future. Mm-hmm. If God were a purely passive observer, then we could say, yes, God observes all times simultaneously, as it were, and his knowledge of the future is just like his knowledge of the past. But Christians think, well, God also wills the future. He wills certain things to happen, certain things not to happen. So he can't just be an observer. Mm-hmm. And once we allow the divine will to intrude, once we say, well, God wills that will happen, he wills that won't happen, then it can be quite hard to avoid a fully fledged predestination. Yeah. But that's a problem really left for the Middle Ages. But Origen just sort of broaches the problem. Mm-hmm. He recognizes that God's foreknowledge of the future, if it's perfect, might present a problem for free will. And he says, well, no, because knowing is one thing and willing is another. And he doesn't get very much further than that, in my view.
Yeah, he seems to be, there are 3 key passages in Origen where he really works this debate out in Book 3 of On First Principles, 3:1, which has an almost verbatim discussion in, chapter 6 of On Prayer, where he distinguishes humans from animals and immaterial or material objects so some things can only be moved from outside of themselves. So a rock can only be moved if I pick it up and throw it. Yep. The spider is moved by a fantasia that emerges in the mind, and then it kind of acts instinctively. Whereas we have logos, where we reason and we judge the stimuli before we act. Very similar conversation in On Prayer. And then there's that fragment from the commentary on Genesis where he takes to task the astrologers. Yep. He always seems to be more interested in talking about human moral responsibility, human moral agency.
Yeah.
That always seems to be like the subject that he's really trying to grapple with.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's accurate, or if you think he is dealing more with the metaphysical question or not. I don't know.
No, as I say, I think the metaphysical question he rather postpones. And the distinction he makes between inanimate, animate, and intelligent beings is very much like Alexander. Alexander also says that animals are moved by horme or impulse. They don't reason, they don't set themselves a choice between good and bad. And of course, the Stoics also, as I say, the Stoics do in fact believe that we can take moral responsibility. Whatever their teaching on fate may be, it certainly doesn't mean that I can't decide whether or not to resist the emperor, or to do the many other things which Stoics did. Stoics, of course, take a very high degree of moral responsibility, and were known for their willingness to be martyred for their beliefs. So, in a way, all these three, the Christians, the Peripatetics, the Stoics, they're all defending a very similar idea of moral responsibility. Alexander's own objection to the Stoics is that if you really believe in fate, there wouldn't be rewards and punishments. There wouldn't be any way of judging people as moral agents. And as I say, the Stoics would simply say, well, we do judge people as moral agents. And so I suppose Alexander would say, but what's your metaphysical justifications for doing so? But yes, there's no one in the ancient world really maintaining that human beings are absolute automata. Even astrologers will say that they believe that there's a kind of inner freedom that human beings have. Even if I'm fated to die in 2 weeks' time, I can decide how I respond to that.
That's right.
I can respond virtuously or viciously. So even astrologers would say that not everything's predetermined.
Yeah, that's right. And we see these discussions play out in cognitive behavior therapy today. So they're still quite relevant for human behavior today. It's quite curious, in On Prayer, which I actually didn't know, Aristotle wrote a treatise himself on prayer. Okay.
It's referred to once by an author called Simplicius. Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that. All right. Origen seems to say, because one of the main objections to prayer that comes out in the treatise is, if things are predetermined, if God foreknows what's going to happen, prayer is useless, so don't pray. And Origen seems to turn the discussion around and say, well, if you're praying for some kind of material gain, or for something to change, you're praying for the wrong things. But the act of prayer itself, Origen says, is the reward, or I shouldn't say it's the reward, but through it we are rewarded by our soul being kind of conditioned in virtue, and it's quite a brilliant argument, I think. But it's something I really want to take a dive into this at some point in my future, because it's a fascinating conversation, and I need to get into these debates about fate in the 2nd century, which will help, I think, flesh out the idea more. Something that I wanted to get at, so 2 figures emerge. Well, more than 2 figures emerge in your book, but there are 2 that kind of stick out. And that's John Philoponus, 6th century, I think, right? 500s in Alexandria, Egypt, and Boethius.
Yep.
And I know very little about Philoponus, but he was actually writing commentaries on Aristotle. So he's a Christian writing commentaries on pagan works. That's quite fascinating. And talk a little bit about him.
At the 6th century, when, of course, there are almost no pagans left, and Justinian is said to have expelled the philosophers from Athens in 529, which in fact is the date at which Philoponus wrote his great treatise on the eternity of the world. And even though, in fact, there is some Neoplatonism, certainly in Alexandria, for another generation, basically well before the end of the 6th century, all pagan thinking seems to be dead. And as far as we know, pagan worship is dead in the Eastern Empire, the Greek-speaking world. And so effectively, Philoponus is succeeding to the patrimony of the pagans. There's nobody left, as it were, to interpret Aristotle now, apart from the Christians. There is Simplicius, is his contemporary, and he's almost, and he's a pagan, and he's a strong opponent of Philoponus, and very conscious, I think, of his, as he would see, his fidelity to the tradition, because he's not a Christian. Philoponus himself, some people think he was a convert. Many people think that he started off more Platonic in his reading of Aristotle and then became less Platonic, but that doesn't necessarily tell us anything about his Christianity, of course. But certainly when he's writing at least some of these commentaries, he's definitely a Christian, because, for example, in the commentary on the third book of Aristotle's Physics, which I translated a long time ago, he intervenes at one point to criticize Aristotle. Normally, he just expounds to make it, because his purpose is, to help other people read Aristotle. But he's so angry with Aristotle's argument for the eternity of the world that he feels that he has to intervene and point out that even on Aristotle's own principles, an eternal world wouldn't make sense. And he's very highly rated as a commentator. I mean, probably people who study ancient philosophy, particularly Richard Sorabji, who's presided over the translation of well over 100 texts now from the later commentators on Aristotle, I think would regard Philoponus as the greatest of the Aristotelian commentators. And so irrespective of his Christianity, he is a very accomplished philologist. Now, in addition to this, Philoponus wrote treatises on Christology. He was living after the Council of Chalcedon, which had asserted that Jesus Christ is one person, but in two natures, human and divine. And the support, this was, according to the Council of Chalcedon, they were interpreting the teaching of Cyril of Alexandria, who had been declared orthodox against Nestorius at the Council of Ephesus in 431. But Cyril himself did not like the terminology of one person in two natures. And so a significant number of Christians after Chalcedon, especially in Egypt, argued that Chalcedon had in fact not interpreted Cyril, but betrayed him. And Philoponus was one of those who didn't think that the Council of Chalcedon had got it right. In his Arbiter, which is preserved only in Syriac, he argues that the Chalcedonians aren't actually heretical, but their terminology is misleading or indeed downright incongruous, and that instead of talking about two natures, they should have talked about one composite nature in Christ. So according to Philoponus, this would be a better way of interpreting what Cyril of Alexandria meant. And no doubt that's what the Chalcedonians were trying to do, but their language had just led them into something very close to heresy. Anyway, unfortunately, of course, it was the Chalcedonians who won, and so it was Philoponus who was declared to be heretical, which is why this treatise only exists in Syriac. And then there's also his writing on the Trinity. And here we go back to Aristotle's meanings of the word ousia, because in the categories, as I say, an ousia can be either a concrete entity or, as it were, the species. Now, Philoponus won't admit that there can be any difference between ousia and hypostasis. So the normal, the standard Christian formulation in his time regarding the Trinity, which comes from the Cappadocians, is that the Father, the Son, and Spirit are three hypostases, but they're all one ousia. Philoponus says, well, hypostasis and ousia basically both mean the same thing. So this distinction is nonsense. And he affirms that there are actually three ousiai. The Father is one ousia, the Son is one ousia, and the Spirit is one ousia. But of course, if each of them is a different ousia, they can't be homoousios. They can't have the same ousia. Whatever we mean by the word ousia, you can't have three of them and say that they're homoousios at the same time. So again, this exists only in Syriac because, again, his so-called tritheism was heretical. So although he's such an ardent Christian in many ways and such an accomplished philosopher, Philoponus actually has a reputation of being a heretic. But one of the works of his that survives that's neither a heretical tract nor a commentary is the treatise against Proclus, the Neoplatonist, on the eternity of the world. And what Philoponus is addressing is the big problem that Aristotle had argued against Plato. If it was ever good to create a world, then it must always be good. I mean, there's no reason why God would create a world at one time or another, because before there's a world, obviously, there are no conditions, no specific conditions which could make it better to create. So Aristotle says, well, there's got to be an eternal world. And the Platonists themselves, whatever Plato himself had said, the Platonists themselves by the Christian era generally agreed with Aristotle that Plato must have meant that the world is eternal. And many Christians have admitted the philosophical cogency of this argument. I mean, Aquinas has a treatise, for example, on the eternity of the world, where he admits the philosophical cogency of saying an eternal God ought to create an eternal world. And Gregory of Nyssa, in arguing against Eunomius with regard to the second person of the Trinity, had said, well, if God has the capacity, the dunamis, to do something, then he does it. God doesn't go through a phase of having capacity and then exercising capacity. So if God has the capacity to beget a son, he eternally begets a son. The trouble with that is, of course, you might say, so if God has the capacity to create a world, does he eternally create a world? Now, as far as I know, Gregory of Nyssa doesn't address that question. But Philoponus, who is a much deeper philosopher than Gregory, realizes that this is a problem. And by the time he's writing in the 6th century, a very strong defense of the eternity of the world has been produced by the Aristotelian Platonist Proclus of Athens. So Philoponus responds at enormous length, 600 pages, to Proclus, arguing again that, well, first of all, that he argues that Plato definitely believed in a temporal creation of the world and not an eternal world. So if you're a Platonist, you shouldn't believe in an eternal world. He argues against Aristotle that if you had an eternal world, you'd have an eternal number of human beings an infinite number of human beings who'd existed. And one of Aristotle's premises is that you cannot have an actual infinity. Infinity can only be, as it were, a concept. It can't be a real thing. So Philoponus says, well, so on Aristotle's own view, the total number of human beings who've existed cannot be infinite. Therefore, you cannot have an eternal world. And he also tries to address this question of how can God, as it were, eternally will the world to exist, and yet the world doesn't exist eternally. And he comes up with some interesting ideas about the nature of willing itself, and argues that willing isn't really an action that takes place in time. And I'm not sure I fully understand what he's trying to say, but it seems very innovative, and I think requires more critical discussion than people have yet given it. He also has views about matter, which are quite interesting. He says that matter can't be distinguished from three-dimensional bodies. That matter effectively always has three dimensions, whereas from Aristotle's point of view, matter is something which has no predicates at all. So there are some very innovative philosophical theses in this work, as well as some very ingenious argumentation against Aristotle from his own thinking, as well as from biblical roots. And of course, he also asserts that the world must be created because the Bible says so, but he recognizes that that's not enough. If you're arguing with philosophers, you've got to produce a good philosophical argument as well. So it seems to me to be actually one of the neglected philosophical masterpieces of the ancient world. I mean, I'm not the only person who's written about it, but on the other hand, the number of people who have written about it is considerably less than the number of people who write every day about Plato's Timaeus or Aristotle's Metaphysics. And I think it could do with a bit more scrutiny, especially from people who are really steeped in ancient philosophy.
Interesting, very interesting.
So that's Philoponus anyway. And of course, people in the Greek world don't have surnames even in the 6th century AD, so they tend to have nicknames. And unfortunately, by the 6th century AD, nearly all of them are called John. He was called John Philoponus, the labor-loving John, because of the magnitude of his writings. But it's also a name that was given to Origen, because again, he was such a prolific writer.
And Origen gave that name to Ambrose in a letter that's preserved. So it's a fitting name, I suppose, from what I'm hearing about John Philoponus.
Indeed, so yes, yeah.
So
Boethius is
Boethius, yes.
Boethius is more or less contemporary. He was living in Italy at the time. He was from a very rich and distinguished senatorial family, but that didn't count for an awful lot, because by this time the Western Empire had fallen, and Italy was under the governance of the Gothic king Theodoric, who was in many ways a very enlightened and capable ruler, but if you were a member of the old Roman patrician class, you probably wouldn't think so. And it's a bit of a Cromwell figure, as it were. Boethius spent a lot of his time writing commentaries on Aristotle, particularly the logical works and translations as well. And those logical works became the foundation of a lot of medieval logic. So the scholastics often refer back to Boethius whenever they're talking about what Aristotle really thought. He wrote treatises on the Trinity and on the two natures in Christ, and unlike Philoponus, he managed to avoid falling into heresy. And he makes use of Aristotelian terminology, but he twists it in ways that Aristotle wouldn't, and arrives at the conclusions he wants to arrive at. Of course, his most famous work is The Consolation of Philosophy, which he wrote when Theodoric had put him in prison for allegedly intriguing with the Byzantine emperor to have Italy taken over by the Eastern Roman Empire. In this work, he hardly refers to Christianity at all. Many people say, either he'd given up Christianity, or maybe he never was a Christian, or there are various theories. My own feeling is that you can actually detect some Christian controversies in the later books. The books 4 and 5 are particularly famous because that's where he discusses divine foreknowledge. And some of the terminology he uses is reminiscent of Augustine. And I think, although he won't say in so many words that he disagrees with Augustine, I think he is questioning the Augustinian theory of predestination. While at the same time also trying to solve the old conundrum as to how God can foreknow the future without depriving us of our freedom. But to me, he's not as great a figure as Philoponus, but on the other hand, in terms of influence, of course, he's enormous because, as I say, everybody in the scholastic era refers back to him, and one of Aquinas's major treatises is a commentary on the De Trinitate of Boethius, for example.
You say about going back to Philoponus, you say that he foreshadowed, who was it, Newton? Or who is it that he...
Well, I mentioned this. This is why Philoponus became very fashionable in the 1990s, that it was argued that he made at least two very important steps, two important strides in natural philosophy, as it were. One was that he recognized the inertia law. So whereas Aristotle and other Greeks thought that in order to keep moving, a body needs a force propelling it from behind, Philoponus recognized that once a body starts moving, there's no reason why it will stop unless there's a force preventing it from moving. So it's the Newtonian law that every body continues in its present state of motion unless it's acted upon by an external force. And the second thing he does is to argue against Aristotle on the question of the void. So Aristotle said that the very notion of a void is impossible, and he put forward a number of logical arguments which were supposed to show that you fell into contradiction if you posited a void, whereas Philoponus responds to those arguments. And certainly, in terms of post-Einsteinian physics, I'm not quite sure what one would say, but in terms of Newtonian physics, it certainly seems that Philoponus was on Newton's side, as it were, against Aristotle, and therefore can be seen as foreshadowing some very important advances in the history of ideas.
Yeah, he was only about a 1,000 years before.
Almost exactly 1,000 years before Newton's birth. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's a striking observation.
1100 years before Newton's birth, in fact.
Okay. I'm going to have to look at John Philoponus a little bit more in my work, because he sounds like a pretty interesting dude. So we're at about an hour. I don't know how long you can hang around. Is there anything that we haven't discussed from your book that you think might be worth bringing up? I don't want to talk about your entire book because I still want people to buy it. And I'm sure you probably want people to buy it as well, but if there's anything else?
Not really. I think, I suppose what the point I make in the conclusion is that Aristotle has meant different things to different people. It still does. There are still people who argue that there are 2 or even 3 Aristotles in terms of different conflicting systems in the Aristotelian corpus, even though it's all the work of one man. But I think in the early centuries of Christianity, Aristotle's really somebody you don't talk about, because they saw him as someone who didn't believe in God in the way that they did. He didn't believe in a creator God. He didn't really believe in providence in the sense of God intervening in everyday life. He didn't believe in immortality. He certainly didn't believe in the resurrection of the body, and possibly didn't believe in the immortality of the soul, because he saw the soul as a form of the body and therefore perhaps perishing with the body. So early Christians always thought Plato was better.
Yeah.
But then in the 3rd century, we get this great synthesis of Aristotelian and Platonic thought, which we call Neoplatonism, exemplified above all by Plotinus. And it's after that that it really becomes possible for Christians to appropriate Aristotelian ideas, because these ideas have now been, as it were, Platonized. And so we should recognize, that when Christians are thinking of Aristotle or using Aristotelian terminology in the 6th century AD, it's quite a different thing from using Aristotelian terminology in the 2nd century AD, because in the 2nd century AD, it looks like a kind of supping with the enemy, whereas in the 6th century AD, it's not. And of course, eventually, with the high scholastic era, after a brief ban on the reading of Aristotle, Aristotle comes to be seen as the philosopher of the church, and in many ways more Christian than Plato.
I think you bring up an interesting point. A needed point is that when we're dealing with these early Christian thinkers, 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, we have to wonder whether they're reading Aristotle himself or handbooks, textbooks on Aristotle. So if they're getting him secondhand, so to speak. There are a number of occasions where Origen mentions Aristotle by name in his commentaries. There's one in a fragment that's preserved in the Philokalia. I forget, it's a fragment from his commentary on Psalm 4, I think. And it's in the heading, something about that of the things that are, some things are good, some things are bad, but not as Aristotle thinks. I'm doing my best to remember what he says. And then at the very beginning, I think, of his commentary on the Psalms in Patrologia Graeca, book 12, he mentions Aristotle. But I haven't done enough to see what he's actually going to say about Aristotle. But I found that striking because Origen, as you know, so rarely references names, unless he's going to be critical.
Yes, I mean, obviously the vast majority of his references to any Greek philosopher by name are in the Contra Celsum, the tract against the Greek philosopher Celsus, because Celsus himself was constantly quoting the classical philosophers. And there, I think, nearly all the references to Aristotle are pretty negative, and I don't think any of them is an actual quotation, or certainly the vast majority of them are not quotations. It's fairly clear in the ancient world that people did not, as a rule, read Aristotle directly. I think it's partly because he was difficult, but also because his prose was considered to be rather ugly. So the great thing about Plato is, that he's one of the greatest Greek prose stylists, as well as arguably the greatest Greek philosopher. So everybody, even if they weren't philosophers, everybody had to be able to quote a bit of Plato. But nobody was expected to quote Aristotle, because it would just spoil your rhetoric, basically, by introducing this plebeian, this sort of enigmatic, elliptical prose. So it's quite likely, this is why Alexander of Aphrodisias has become quite important for Origen studies. Other scholars like Ilaria Ramelli and Panayotis of Malikos have made a great deal of him as well, because Alexander's certainly a much smoother, more elegant writer than Aristotle himself. And it seems quite likely that people would get their knowledge of Aristotle through someone like him, rather than from the fountain.
Well, even in terms of commentaries, Alexander's got the lemma by lemma commentary, which is very closely akin to Origen's style of doing biblical commentary. So I think there's been work. I think Ronald Heine, for example, has done some work on the Aristotelian background of Origen's commentaries.
Yes.
You mentioned the Contra Celsum. There's this wonderful passage in book 1. I'll just quote it here because it's quite wonderful. Even though they do not want to admit it, it is by an unreasoning impulse that people come to the practice of, say, Stoicism, and abandon the rest, or Platonism because they despise the others as of lesser significance, or Peripateticism, so Aristotelianism, because it corresponds best to human needs and sensibly admits the value of the good things of human life more than other systems, which is a very striking kind of admiration of Aristotle in a way. He's saying Aristotle brought Plato down to earth a little bit, but that might be the most positive thing he says about him.
Yes, of course, he said, and he doesn't mention Aristotle by name there. You know, he talked about philosophies as ways of life, and as I'm sure you know, I mean, the French scholar Pierre Hadot has argued at great length that we should see ancient philosophies as what he calls spiritual disciplines. That they are above all ways of living. You're not a philosopher just because you can write articles in learned journals about what Aristotle really thought. You're a philosopher if you actually live the philosophy that you profess. And everybody in the ancient world who taught philosophy, had to define themselves, as it were, denominationally, as a peripatetic, a Stoic, a Platonist, or whatever. So it's much more like being a priest in some ways, than it is like being a philosopher in the modern world. And the peripatetics, of course, do continue to think logic's very important, as we know from their commentaries. But even the peripatetics would have said, if you're not living a certain kind of life, then there's no point being a philosopher.
Yeah, if you're not practicing virtue, you're missing the point. Yeah. Well, Dr. Edwards, thank you for a wonderful conversation. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. I think we need to take into consideration Aristotle's influence in early Christianity a bit more than what has been done. Not to say that Plato wasn't important, but Aristotle was a pretty important figure too. So thank you for joining PatristiCast.
Thank you very much.